But I think that's part of what you have been able to bring to the table over the last several years, really through the whole Tucker Carlson Tonight run, and now your show on Twitter, or X, excuse me. It's going to take me years to get that right.
We call it X, Dave.
Yes, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to I messed up. Still not my favorite.
Just a single letter.
I like a lot of what Elon Musk has done. Changing it to X was the second worst besides his trip to Israel.
Are we pronouncing that correctly, or is it zh? Is it more Chinese? I mean, like, how do you pronounce it?
I was counting on Twitter to be the one non-Chinese social media company, so I hope it's not. I hope that's not it. But there was one of the things you do on your show that I really like. I try to do this too, because I do a show about the news, and one of the things I try to do as best as possible, which is challenging in today's environment, is to zoom out as much as you can, because it's like every day there's a new crazy thing. But then one day there's a crazy thing and you go like, no, wait, this is not just a crazy thing. This is one of the biggest stories in American history. Like, this isn't just some crazy thing. This is like the 3-letter agencies tried to frame the sitting president for treason. That's a really big deal. That's up there with like top 5 stories in American history, right?
Yeah.
But I gotta say, I think one of them has gotta be you and this show you're doing on X. And look, I love it. I never miss an episode of it. But regardless of that, the fact is that the biggest show host in cable news gets fired and then has to move online and is bigger by orders of magnitude. Like, that's a really big deal. That just represents...
It's a better medium. I mean,
right.
We used to say in TV, like I was on a couple different or several different channels, cable channels, broadcast channels, and like my ratings would vary dramatically. And the show, maybe better or worse, depending, but like over 25 years. But it's the venue matters a lot. And it just turns out that people use social media and far fewer subscribe to cable news and consume their information sitting in their living room like that. It was just so obvious. And I'm such a late adapter because I'm not into tech at all. We don't have a TV in my house. We're not tech people at all. We're book readers. So I only sensed it. But as soon as you make it easy for people to consume free, effectively, we've got a subscription service launching. But basically, the meat of it is, a lot of it is free and always will be. Your viewership goes up. And also, I think, it's pretty obvious. It's certainly obvious to you and your entire audience. But like, the media are controlled. That's the whole point. And as soon as people sense you're not controlled or less controlled or you're out of control, they want to watch, right? I mean, why wouldn't they?
Yeah, no, absolutely. But it does, like, what it represents is, right, like a real losing of that control. And for the first time, at least in my lifetime, that there isn't kind of this monopoly on the flow of information. And of course, Elon Musk buying Twitter is a big part of that. And he's going to be is already dealing with tremendous forces trying to, interfere with that. But at least for now, it does seem like, yeah, they're the two guys I usually point to are you and Joe Rogan, but between you two guys and then a whole bunch of other guys, like on smaller levels, but like a lot of them, it's like, yeah, there's a whole new generation of people who are consuming their information that is not controlled. That doesn't mean it's correct all of the time. I'm sure we all make our mistakes, but it's not controlled by the CIA. Like, there is a difference there.
That's exactly right. And actually, I know you know this because we've talked about it offline, but if you were to say out loud in specific terms the degree of control that specific agency, and there are many other agencies, but that one specifically, CIA, had over our public conversation and over our politics, you'd sound like a complete freaking wacko. Like, people wouldn't even believe you, and yet it would be absolutely true. So I guess what I'm saying is we understate the power, and I'm speaking this from knowledge after 35 years in Washington, knowing a lot of people who work there and knowing a lot about it. We understate the power of this intel agency with an unknown budget, unknown staff, unknown reach, unknown mission. Like, it's completely out of control, like much more than people understand. It's completely out of control. And it's also completely corrupt. I was telling my wife at dinner, actually, 2 nights ago, with a bunch of relatives sitting there, we were thinking of 4 separate real estate transactions that we were personally party to or on the same street or next door to or whatever of CIA officers, current CIA officers who are paying millions of dollars for very expensive real estate. And my wife's like, oh, what about that one? We sold our house once to a CIA officer for all this money. It's like, and the question was like, where do they get all this money? You're a federal employee. Where'd you get $4 million or $12 million? You know what I mean? Like, leaving aside the assassinations and the subversion of democracy, just the pure financial corruption of the CIA is like a mind-blowing story that the average person knows nothing about. True.
Yeah. And look, and this is one of the things that Trump, and in many ways, just to be clear here, I think Trump is almost like this, like Inspector Gadget type political figure where, you know, like he's just kind of walking around and things just all fall into place. But one of the things that Trump kind of revealed, even to people like myself, who probably, like if I was taking a written test on this, would have gotten the answer right before Trump, but to actually witness it, and not just on like an intellectual level, but to watch it happening, is that you're like, they do not work for the president. I mean, this is not something that idea. And it's almost as if we're talking about the federal government of the United States of America, and we're still discussing it as if there are these three co-equal branches of government, and the people elect the president and they elect the House of Representatives, and you're like, oh, that's not really the government we live under. That in fact, there's these whole other shadowy forces that are completely untied to that. They oversee the politicians much more than the politicians oversee them, and that's really who's kind of in charge. And then it's like, okay, we're talking about a whole different thing.
I mean, I could bore you for hours, but you're absolutely 100% right. It makes a mockery of democracy. And the defenders of democracy are the ones propping it up. It's also grotesque, but I would just say one thing, and that is that I know this for a fact, that the sitting president of the United States, there have been, of course, 40 odd since the Second World War, have routinely been left out of briefings on the two big programs that I know about. One is the UFO stuff, where there's a lot of evidence the U.S. government has had direct contact, maybe even negotiations with whatever these forces are. That's real, I think. But I know for a fact that presidents have not been briefed on that. One. Two is the Kennedy assassination, in which the CIA was implicated. Not the whole CIA, but the operations directorate under Angleton had a role in that. That's just true. And I know for a fact that there have been a number of presidents, Richard Nixon famously on tape, asked the CIA director about that. And he said, I think the CIA was involved in killing John, quote. And they did not respond. They did not brief him. And instead they set in motion the wheels of Watergate, which had him out of office in less than a year. So like, that's not a democracy. That's an oligarchy by unelected spies. And there's nothing scarier than that. And by the way, last thing I'll say, if everyone talks about, the famous Eisenhower retirement speech, where in 1960, where he talks about the military industrial complex, that's where that phrase comes from, that famous speech. Last year, I was on a freaking treadmill trying to lose weight, perpetual mission of mine. And I'm bored. So I was like, I'm going to find that on YouTube. I'd recommend to your listeners, watch that speech. I think it's only like 30 minutes long. Eisenhower wrote it himself. Two things you'll notice. One, it's written at the level of like postgraduate. Like the average American had such a higher IQ, was so much more literate in 1960 than now. People wouldn't even understand what he was saying. A. B. Eisenhower was like deeply distressed by the power of the Pentagon and the CIA, and said so in public. And he's like, their budgets are too big thanks to the Second World War, and this is going to end democracy. He said that on television in front of everybody. It's totally worth watching. And he was right.
And hands the country over to John F. Kennedy. I mean, this is like for people, like this is the next president that comes right in on the heels of that. Right. And then also, this is something I remember you talking about this when you covered it, because it's so like I was a kid. I'm born in 1983. It's like I grew up in the 80s and the 90s. And at that point, the only thing you knew about Richard Nixon was like, yeah, he was the most corrupt president. And it's like this tiny little detail that's left out, that he was the most popular president. That he won 49 states.
He won by the biggest margin ever, 16 million votes in 1972. Yes. Biggest margin ever recorded. Yeah.
And he's gone shortly after that. And they control the narrative so much that the narrative almost becomes like, the people really didn't like him. They really didn't like him so much. We had to get him out of there.
Well, what's so crazy is that he was undone by this guy famously called Bob Woodward, who's still around, still writing books, still getting the participation of all of our leaders. Who was Bob Woodward in 1973? Was he a famous journalist? He got the biggest story in the world was handed to him by Ben Bradley, the editor of the Washington Post. No, he was not a journalist. He was a naval intel officer who'd been detailed to the White House, the Nixon White House. That's a fact. Look it up. And yet somehow he winds up with this story that topples a president. And his main source, who was the main source? That was Mark Felt, the deputy director of the FBI, who ran the COINTEL program.
Yeah.
What? This is not conspiracy stuff. This is like on Wikipedia.
Yeah.
And whoever says it, it's crazy. And by the way, who replaced Nixon? Gerald Ford, unelected, who happened to be on the what? Oh, the Warren Commission.
Yeah.
How Nixon pick Ford? Well, because they took out his VP Spiro Agnew on a tax charge. And then Carl Albert, who was the Democratic leader in the House, said, you are picking Gerald Ford. And he did.
It really is like it's out of a movie, man. And it does that, like, I get where it does sound like, if people don't follow this stuff, it sounds like nutty conspiracy talk. And it is conspiracy talk. It is a conspiracy. It's just not a theory. It's just like, no, this is all like documented.
And Bob Woodward, I mean, like, I know Bob Woodward pretty well. I lived right down the street from Bob Woodward in Georgetown as a kid. And it's like, I'm not attacking, he's a perfectly nice guy and he's not stupid, actually. But the idea that, he's just a shoe leather journalist. No, he was a naval intel officer who somehow wind up as like one of his very first stories in the Washington Post is Watergate. Like, that's just so obviously bullshit that, like,
yeah, that's just not how it works.
One person say that. Not one person. Why?
Right. And it's such an interesting story that you're like, it kind of goes to show you, that's why like, you would want to talk about this if you were just trying to get eyeballs on your show, but no one will touch it. At least in the corporate media, nobody will touch it. Why
though? It's so look. I mean, I'm 54, my kids are grown, so I don't really care. But like, I just think if you're in this business and you're not curious, the question is, why are you in this business? Like, the whole point is curiosity. Like, wow, tell me how that happened. That's an amazing story. Like, that's why I do this. That's why I got into this in the first place. No one is interested in anything. It's like bizarre. It's like, well, shut up. Everything you heard in fourth grade is true. Shut up, racist.
Would you remember? I'm blanking on her name. Maybe you remember it. It was the ABC reporter who she had the hot mic tape that leaked where she was talking about how she had the Epstein story broke years before, and they told her to squash it because it might mess up the relationship with the royal family.
Yeah, what happened to her? Do you know?
I'm not sure where she is. But that.
But Amy Robach. It was Amy Robach, who I worked with at another, the cable arm of NBC News years ago. I didn't know her very well, but she's totally nice. She says that on the air, and I'm not a conspiracy nut. I'm just, everything I know, I read in the Daily Mail. I'm just telling you, Dave. And then, like, 2 or 3 years later, she gets bounced out of her job at ABC because she had an affair. Now, I'm not endorsing affairs. I'm not having one. I'm against them. However, if we were to fire everybody in television who's having an affair with a coworker, no one would report for work. Like, that's not a fireable offense.
MSNBC might need to find a new morning show. I'll say that much.
Well, yeah, exactly. And like, just trust me, that's not a criterion for firing. And yet Amy Robach got fired for having an affair. That's kind of weird.
Right.
It's almost like they forgot about that part. To fire Amy Robach since she got caught. And by the way, they made her apologize for it. They made her apologize. And she issues this hostage statement trying to keep her job. Like, when I said the Epstein stuff was real, I was just kidding. It's like, what?
Younger people say the news is full of lies.
In Kennedy's motorcade,
239 people. The death of Jeffrey Epstein.